The first indicator of a true internal shift isn't transformation. It's detachment, a subtle lack of concern for the life you once carefully upheld. That detachment can feel strange, even unsettling. Not because anything is broken, but because what once felt convincing no longer does. The goals that once directed your actions lose their urgency. The identity you defended starts to feel optional. Rather than fixed, you're not turning against your past. And you're not rushing toward a future. You're simply no longer bound to a version of life that once felt necessary. This is where the moment is often misunderstood. People assume inertia, the search for clarity, motivation, or a spark to reignite direction. But something more exact is happening. The internal architecture holding your reality together is loosening, not falling apart, and in that space, life becomes editable long before anything outwardly changes. From a neurological perspective, this is what happens when emotional charge detaches. From habitual thought loops, the brain loses its old predictions, certainty. FUD's direction feels temporarily suspended. Spiritually, this phase has always been recognized as a threshold, punt where the old identity can know longer carry the future forward, yet no one hasn't fully stepped in. Different languages, same experience. What makes this phase confusing is its subtlety. There's no dramatic breakdown to point to, no obvious sign that something is ending, just a growing neutrality toward what once defined you. And that neutrality isn't emptiness. It's space that didn't exist. But space where a different version of reality can begin organizing itself. Thus is why real quantum shifts don't start with visible action, they start with an internal release so quiet that most people dismiss it, but once that release begins, going back to the old way of being feels strangely impossible, even if nothing outside has changed yet. And this is only the first shift. There's a sequence that follows, untunneled, precise, and often sun-kissed, that determines whether this moment becomes a temporary pause or a genuine jump into a new timeline. Most people follow these shifts without recognizing them. A few sense that something progressible has started, and few are still understand how to move through what comes next without collapsing back. And it's the familiar, that's where the real process begins. Once indifference replaces attachment, something else begins to shift quietly. Your internal state, not your thoughts, not your plans, your baseline, the way your body holds tension, the way emotions rise and fall, the way you respond before you have time to think. This is where most people lose the plot because they expect reality to change first, but in every real quantum jump, the order is reversed. You may notice that reactions soften, situations that once triggered urgency or defensiveness no longer hook you in the same way. There's a strain, neutrality that settles in, not coldness, not apathy, just less pun. The nervous system stops bracing for impact, and when that happens, perception itself changes. You're still in the same environment, but it doesn't land on you the same way. And from a biological perspective, thus is a shift in autonomic regulation. Its body moves out of chronic survival mud and into coherence. Heart rhythm stabilizes, stress hormones decrease. The system stops scanning for threat and starts conserving energy. When the body exits survival, the mind loses its obsession with control. That's why clarity doesn't arrive yet. Clarity belongs to stability, not transition. Spiritually, this is the moment Frequency changes before form, long. Before circumstances rearrange, the untunnel signal becomes cleaner, less. Naza less contradiction, the field responds to this immediately, even if this reflection takes time to appear. Thus is where people confuse patience with stagnation. Nothing looks like it's happening yet. Everything important already has. What's deceptive about this phase is how Adana it feels. There's no rush of excitement, no emotional high. If unthung, life feels simpler, quieter, almost boring compared to the internal chaos you used to live in. But that quad is not emptiness, it's coherence. And coherence is what allows probabilities to collapse cleanly, instead of scattering across timelines. Thus is also why forcing positivity or visualization during this phase often falls off. The system isn't asking for stomachsletpun, it's asking for consistency every time you respond. Come lower you once reacted, the sudden strengthens every time you choose presence over prediction, the new stat stabilizes further, you're touching your body what reality it belongs in. Now you might catch yourself pausing more before speaking, chusung differently without rehearsing, Ruzans letting things pass without interpreted pun. Those are not small changes, they're evidence that your internal state is no lunga organized around the old aduntata, and once the body leads, the mind eventually follows. The mistake is trying to rush this part. People assume something has gone wrong because nothing dramatic is happening. They abandon the shuffed right here, reaching back for famala emotional intensity just to fall something recognizable again. But intensata isn't movement, it's repetition. Real movement feels subtler than that. This internal state shift is what allows the next phase to unfold. Without it, action feels forced. With it, movement becomes almost inevitable. Not impulsive, inevitable, because once its body is no longer aligned with the past, staying still begins to feel heavier than stepping forward, and that's when the third shift begins, not as a plan, but as motion without guarantees. After your internal state stabilizes, something subtle but decisive happens. Staying still begins to feel heavier than moving, not because you suddenly feel confident, but because Hazatutpa no longer feels aligned. This is where the third internal shift pmajas, movement without guarantees. And this is the point where most people Uthka change timelines or retreat. The actions that arise here don't look strategic, they often don't make sense to the version of you that needed proof. But for acting, they're small sometimes, quite sometimes inconvenient. A conversation you stop avoiding, decision you make without rehearsing, of outcome, a boundary you set without explaining yourself. These moves aren't dramatic enough to feel like transformatpan, yet they carry dasprapatpanat weight because they broke continuity with the old pattern. From the brain's perspective, this is how new timelines become neurologic. Vubbed, action introduces new sensory Fudbik, new feedback interrupts product pun, and when prediction fails, this mind becomes flexible. This is why intentpun alone rarely produces quantum jump. The nervous system needs evidence that a different future is being lived, even if only in fragments. Movement supplies that evidence. Sparatali, this is the moment faith becomes practical, not as belief, but as evidenza to a quiet internal signal. You don't move because you're sure it will work, you move because not moving false dishonest to who you're becoming. Thus distinction matters, action rooted. Unfear still belongs to the old. Tumlan, action rooted in alignment. Krada's a rupture, what makes this phase? Uncomfortable is the lack of external reinforcement, reality hasn't caught up. Yet there's no confirmation, no. Applause, sometimes not even relief. Just a strange sense that something has been set in motion. This is where people second guess themselves, replay decisions and look backward for validation. But validation comes later, always. Lutka, because reality responds after. Kahansa, not before, you might notice. Resistance are surfacing here, not from the outside but internally, old thoughts. Question the timing, old identities ask. For logic, old habits try to reassert. Control, this isn't failure, it's fructpun between timelines, the old structure senses that continuity has been broken and tries to restore it. What kit succeeds depends on what happens next if you continue moving. From this place, not impulsively but consistently, the signal strengthens. This field begins reorganizing around the pattern. Opportunities don't appear yet, but pathways do. Options that doesn't exist before become visible, not because the world changed but because your perception did. This is the point. What people say everything started shifting after that one decision. They recognize it at the time. It only becomes obvious in hindsight once the Tumlan has fully collapsed, but the collapse doesn't start with a miracle. It starts with motion that breaks. Repetition, still this phase isn't complete on its own. Movement opens the but something else determines whether you walk through it or turn back, because once the old structure loses stability, discomfort increases. And how you relate to that discomfort decides everything. That's where the fourth shift waits, not as a test but as a threshold. Once movement breaks the old pattern, discomfort intensifies, not because you made a mistake but because the structure that used to hold your reality together has lost stability. Thus is the phase most people mislabel as anxiety, confusion, or self-doubt. In truth, it's friction between identities. This old one hasn't fully released. No one hasn't fully embodied yet, and the nervous system is caught between them. What makes this phase dangerous isn't the discomfort itself, it's how tempting it is to interpret that discomfort as a sign to stop. The mind lacks for familiar explanations. It asks, what you move too fast, whether you sun catch the signal, whether you should go back and think things through. But thinking was never the issue. The discomfort appears precisely because Thunkung no longer has the authority it Yazad too, from a physiological standpoint, this is a liminal state. The Brun dislikes ambiguity. It craves resolution, even if that resolution Mun's returning to something limiting but familiar. That's why the urge to Rutret feels so rational here. The system wants certainty, not expansion. And certainty is always easier to find on the past than in the future. Sparatali, this moment has been Duskra but across traditions as the Krasung, the place where the old self loses leverage. There's often a strange mux of calm and unease, a sense that something important is happening paired with the fear of not knowing what comes next. This combination confuses people because they assume clarity should arrive before peace. In reality, peace often arrives first, clarity follows. Lutka, this is where many quantum jumps collapse quietly, not with failure but with self-interruption. Pupla override the process by reintroducing urgency, distraction, or excessive analysis. They mistake discomfort for danger instead of recognizing it as the natural pressure that accompanies expansion. Growth doesn't feel like improvement in real. It feels like instability. What Metcalfe here is tolerance, not undansa tolerance, the ability to stay present without rushing to resolve. This feeling, the ability to let the nervous system recalibrate without forcing meaning onto the experience. Over time you don't react the way you Yazad to the old timeline weakens. Fadka, every time you remain with the sunsutpan instead of escaping it, the no one stabilizes. Thus is also where external validation becomes irrelevant. Other people may not. So what's happening, some may even question your choices. That doesn't mean you're off track, it means you've stepped outside a shared pattern. When you move between realities, you lose the language that made your old life legible to others. If you pass through this phase without collapsing backward, something important happens next. Space opens, not conceptually, physically, emotionally, cognitively. This grip loosens, the effort drops, the sense of holding everything together floods, and that's when the fifth shift begins, not as loss but as release. After discomfort loosens its grip, something subtle but unmistakable follows. Effort drops, not because everything is resolved, but because you're no longer holding the same untunnel weight. This is the fifth shift, the moment where release happens. Maturity, not through discipline or decision, but because there's nothing left to carry. In the same way, expectatpun soften old attachments. Laza urgency, you stop managing outcomes and start allowing responses. This phase is often misunderstood as loss because things fall away without drama. Habits you once relied on no longer fit. Certain conversations stop repeating themselves. Some desires simply don't come with you, but what's actually happening is capacity returning. When this internal system is no longer overclouded with maintenance, space opens. Cognitively, emotionally, energetically. And space is what reality needs in order to move from a neurological perspective. This is where cognitive load decreases, fewer competing narratives, less internal friction. The brain shifts from constant prediction to receptive awareness. That change alone alters perception. You start noticing possibilities that were always there but never registered because attention was consumed elsewhere. Opportunity doesn't appear suddenly, it becomes visible. Spiritually, this is where the field responds more cleanly, when you're no longer broadcasting mixed signals. Feedback accelerates, synchronicities increase, timing sharpens, things begin to line up without force. This is the phase people later describe as everything just started flowing, even though the groundwork was laid much earlier during moments that felt far less impressive. What's important here is restraint. This is where many people rush to refill the space they've just created. They grab new goals too quickly, they look for meaning too assign, they try to explain what's happening before it has fully settled. But this space is functional, it's the buffer that allows the final shift to occur, because when enough space exists, alignment happens almost automatically. The sixth shift doesn't feel like effort at all, it feels like recognition. Choices stop being debated internally. You begin responding to life from a place that already knows where it's going even if you can't articulate how. Decisions come faster, cleaner, with less explanation required, not because you figured everything out, because the future has started pulling more strongly than the past ever did. This is future self-alignment in its most practical form, not visualization, not imagination, but obedience to a pattern that's already forming. You don't wait for confirmation anymore. You move as if continuity has already been established, because internally it has. The timeline begins collapsing around that assumption, and this is where people look back and say the jump happened all at once. In reality, it was the result of every internal shift leading up to this point. Identity loosened, state changed, movement broke repetition. Discomfort was tolerated, space was created, alignment locked in. What happens next isn't magic, it's momentum. Once the future becomes the dominant reference point, reality reorganizes with surprising speed, not because you forced it, because nothing inside you is resisting it anymore. And when resistance disappears, the field doesn't hesitate. That's the moment people call a quantum jump. Most people don't fail at a quantum jump because they lack discipline or belief. They fail because they don't recognize the phase they're in. They mistake dissolution for regression. They rush clarity before coherence, and without realizing it, they interrupt a process that was already working. What you've just moved through isn't theory, it's a sequence. And once you've crossed certain internal thresholds, there's no real way to unknow them. The only question that remains is how you stabilize what's already shifting so it doesn't fade the moment life speeds up again. This is where many people slip back into old timelines, not because they wanted to, but because the nervous system seeks familiarity under pressure. When identity is in transition, structure matters, not rigid structure. Grounding structure, something that helps the mind and body recognize the new pattern as home. That's why quantum rebirth exists. It was created for this exact moment, when the old way no longer fits and the new one hasn't fully settled yet. It's designed to help you understand what's changing internally, how to move through this transition without rushing or second guessing, and how to stabilize a new sense of self before the external world fully reflects it. Alongside it, the Quantum Grimoire offers a practical way to anchor this shift day by day. Through conscious writing, symbolic focus, and simple grounding practices, it helps translate internal coherence into something repeatable, so the jump doesn't remain a moment but becomes a baseline. If this video resonates, it's likely because you're already in motion, not searching, not waiting, simply passing through a threshold that whispers rather than shouts. The Quantum Rebirth and Grimoire await in the pinned comment, ready whenever you feel called to explore deeper. There's no need to force anything, no need to rush. The shift is already unfolding.